September 1943. Bowmanville, Ontario. 4:17 a.m. The transport trucks groaned to a halt outside Camp 30, their engines ticking in the pre-dawn cold. Inside the canvas-covered beds, 57 German prisoners sat rigid on wooden benches, hands bound loosely with rope that had rubbed their wrists raw during the 18-hour journey from Halifax. They had not slept. Fear kept them upright, fear sharpened by hunger, by rumor, by the propaganda leaflets they'd memorized during training. Canadisch Bestien, the pamphlets had called them. Canadian beasts. Men who would strip you, starve you, work you until your bones showed through your skin. The tailgate dropped with a metallic clang. A voice called out in accented German, "Down. Form 2 lines. Bring your kits." They descended into fog so thick it swallowed the treeline. Gravel crunched beneath their boots. The air smelled of pine resin and diesel exhaust and something else, bread, perhaps, or porridge, something warm drifting from an unseen kitchen. One man, a U-boat mechanic named Horst Muller, aged 22, inhaled deeply and felt his stomach contract with longing. He had eaten nothing but hardtack and canned fish for 3 days. The gate swung open. Barbed wire gleamed faintly in the floodlights. And then the first guard approached, a Canadian sergeant with a weathered face and tired eyes. He looked them over slowly as if counting inventory, and when he spoke his voice carried neither malice nor welcome. Just procedure. You'll be processed, fed, and assigned quarters. You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated accordingly. Horst blinked. Someone behind him whispered, "Gefuttert?" "Vet." The sergeant turned toward the gate. "Follow me. Walk, don't run. If you need medical attention, raise your hand now." 3 hands lifted. The sergeant nodded and gestured to a man in a white coat standing near a brick building. No one shouted. No one struck them. The wire was real, the guards were armed, but the brutality they had braced for, the fists, the curses, the casual cruelty, never arrived. They had been told Canadians were savages. The first word they heard was "accordingly." The story of how German prisoners of war were treated in Canada during World War II is not widely known, even among those who study the conflict. It runs counter to the narratives we cling to, narratives of vengeance, of justified rage, of enemies who deserve nothing. But history is rarely so neat. Between 1940 and 1946, more than 35,000 German POWs passed through Canadian camps, and what they found there defied everything Berlin had promised them. They found fairness. They found discipline. They found, against all expectation, a kind of restrained decency that would reshape their understanding of the war itself. This is not a story of forgiveness. It is a story of what happens when a nation under pressure chooses restraint over retribution, and what that choice reveals about the fragile machinery of civilization. CTA, if this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. Horst Muller had been captured 6 weeks earlier off the coast of Newfoundland. His U-boat, U-744, had surfaced during a storm to recharge its batteries when a Canadian corvette appeared through the sleet like an apparition. There had been no time to dive. The captain gave the order to scuttle, and the crew abandoned ship in freezing water, clinging to debris until the corvette's nets hauled them aboard. Horst remembered the shock of warm air when they dragged him below deck. He remembered a sailor wrapping him in a wool blanket that smelled of tobacco and engine grease. He remembered expecting a rifle butt to the face and receiving instead a tin cup of cocoa so hot it burned his tongue. That contradiction, the gap between expectation and reality, had haunted him for weeks. Now, standing in the assembly yard at Camp 30, it returned with fresh intensity. The camp was enormous. Row upon row of wooden barracks stretched toward the horizon, each building numbered and painted olive drab. Watchtowers loomed at the corners, manned by soldiers with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. But there were also flower beds, lining the main walkway, and a soccer field beyond the wire, and a building with a red cross painted on its roof. It looked less like a prison than a military base. Sterile. Orderly. Almost mundane. An officer stepped forward, a major, judging by the insignia on his uniform, and addressed them in fluent German. His tone was formal but not unkind. "You will be housed in barracks 7 through 9. Each man will receive a bunk, 2 blankets, 1 pillow, and 1 footlocker. You will be issued soap, towels, and razor kits tomorrow morning. Meals are served at 0700, 1200, and 1800 hours. You will form up here each morning for roll call at 0630. Work details begin at 0800 for those deemed fit. Any questions will be directed to your barracks leader, who will be selected by you, not by us." He paused, letting the information settle. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Breakfast is being prepared now. You'll eat before you sleep." A murmur rippled through the ranks. Horst glanced at the man beside him, a tank gunner named Klaus, hollow-cheeked and skeletal, and saw his own disbelief reflected back. Breakfast. Before sleep. Not after interrogation. Not after punishment. No. They were marched to a mess hall that smelled of frying bacon and boiled oats. Long tables stretched the length of the room, each set with metal trays and tin cups. Canadian soldiers stood at the serving line, ladling porridge into bowls with mechanical efficiency. Horst took his tray and sat. The porridge was thick and sweetened with brown sugar. There was bread, real bread, soft and white, and margarine and strips of bacon still sizzling with grease. He ate slowly, forcing himself not to weep. Klaus leaned close and whispered, "They're fattening us for something." Horst shook his head. "No. I don't think so." "Then why?" Horst had no answer. He only knew that the food was real and warm and more than he had eaten in a month. He knew that no one had struck him or spat at him or called him vermin. He knew that the war had taught him to expect the worst from his enemies, and that the worst had not come. The philosophy behind Canada's treatment of POWs was not rooted in sentimentality. It was rooted in pragmatism, diplomacy, and a particular strain of Commonwealth morality that valued order above emotion. In 1940, as Britain faced the possibility of invasion, Winston Churchill requested that Canada take custody of thousands of German and Italian prisoners to relieve pressure on overcrowded British camps. Canada agreed, and in doing so, committed itself to upholding the Geneva Convention with meticulous care. A memo circulated through the Department of National Defense in the spring of 1941. It was brief, 6 sentences typed on onion skin paper, stamped with the War Office seal. The final line read, "Prisoners are soldiers, not criminals. They will be treated with the dignity owed to men who have surrendered honorably." That distinction mattered. It shaped every regulation, every camp layout, every interaction between guard and captive. Security was paramount. Escapes were rare but not impossible, but cruelty was forbidden. Rations matched those of Canadian soldiers. Medical care was provided without prejudice. Red Cross inspectors visited regularly, and their reports were scrupulously honored. The system was not perfect. There were abuses, isolated incidents, moments when exhaustion or anger broke through the facade of professionalism. But the overall structure held. And for the prisoners, that structure became a kind of salvation. It was a triad of principles: security, diplomacy, morality. The wire kept them in. The policy kept them alive. And the philosophy, however distant, however bureaucratic, kept them human. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The initial shock of decent treatment gave way to routine, and routine became something stranger still: normalcy. Horst was assigned to a work detail cutting timber in the forests north of the camp. The labor was hard, but no harder than submarine duty. He was paid 50 cents a day in camp scrip, which could be spent at the canteen on cigarettes, chocolate, and writing paper. He wrote letters home, letters that were censored but not destroyed, and received replies months later, stained with postal ink and folded into impossibly small squares. Life in Camp 30 developed its own rhythm. Morning roll call. Breakfast in the mess. Work until noon. Much more work. Dinner. Evening free time in the barracks, where men played cards, read books borrowed from the camp library, or gathered around a battered piano someone had coaxed back to life. There were lectures, German officers teaching engineering, history, philosophy to younger men who had enlisted straight from school. There were theater performances, staged in a makeshift auditorium with costumes sewn from bedsheets. There was even a newspaper, Der Klang, mimeographed weekly and distributed to all barracks, filled with poetry, satire, and carefully neutral commentary on the war. The Canadians permitted it all. Not out of generosity exactly, but out of recognition that idle men grew desperate, and desperate men caused problems. Keep them busy. Keep them fed. Keep them intact. When the war ended, they would return home, and what they said about their captivity would matter. Horst began to notice small things. The way guards addressed prisoners by rank, not by number. The way disputes were settled through barracks councils rather than punishment cells. The way the camp commandant, Colonel Strait, walked the perimeter each evening at dusk, hands clasped behind his back, nodding to prisoners who saluted him. It was theater, perhaps, a performance of civility, but it was consistent theater. And consistency, Horst realized, was a form of respect. One afternoon in late October, a guard named Corporal Dawson approached Horst's work crew during a water break. He was young, maybe 19, with freckles and a shy smile. He spoke no German, and Horst spoke little English, but they had developed a kind of pantomime communication over the weeks. Dawson pulled a photograph from his breast pocket and showed it to Horst. A farmhouse, a woman in an apron, 2 children sitting on a porch. Home, Dawson said, pointing. Saskatchewan. Horst nodded. He pulled his own photograph from his wallet. His mother standing outside their apartment in Hamburg, her hands shading her eyes from the sun. Mean mutter, he said. My mother. Dawson studied the photo, then handed it back carefully. She's still there? Horst shrugged. You didn't know. The last letter had been dated June. The bombings had intensified since then. He tried to picture his mother in the basement shelter, surrounded by strangers, listening to the sirens wail, but the image dissolved before it fully formed. Dawson clapped him on the shoulder, a brief gesture of solidarity, and moved on. It was nothing. A photograph. A touch. A shared acknowledgement of distance and worry. But it punctured something in Horst, some membrane of resentment he hadn't known he was holding. For the first time since his capture he felt seen. Not as a prisoner. Not as an enemy. As a man with a mother who might be dead. Not all prisoners adapted easily. There were hardliners. Men who clung to Nazi ideology with fierce devotion, who refused to work, who saluted portraits of Hitler smuggled into the barracks and hidden beneath floorboards. They were a minority, perhaps 15%, but they were vocal. They accused moderates of weakness, of betrayal, of forgetting what they fought for. Fights broke out. In one barracks, a man suspected of cooperating with Canadian authorities was beaten so badly he lost hearing in one ear. The Canadians responded with careful calibration. Troublemakers were isolated but not tortured. A separate compound was established for hardcore Nazis, officers who refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Geneva Convention and who treated any kindness as a trap. Colonel Straight visited that compound once a month, walking the perimeter alone, observing. He believed that even the most fervent believer could be worn down by time and consistency. He was sometimes wrong, but he was also sometimes right. A man named Ernst Keller, 34, former SS officer, captured in North Africa, spent his first 6 months at Camp 30 in furious resistance. He refused to salute Canadian officers. He refused to work. He stood at attention during roll call with his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw clenched, his body radiating defiance. Other prisoners avoided him. Guards watched him closely. He seemed to be waiting for an excuse, any excuse, to provoke a confrontation that would confirm his worldview. It never came. Instead, he was assigned to the camp hospital as an orderly. It was not a punishment. The medical staff needed help, and Keller had training as a paramedic. He was given a white apron, a stethoscope, and a list of duties. 4 weeks, he performed them with sullen competence, speaking to no one, offering no courtesies. Then, in early December, a prisoner collapsed during a work detail, heart attack, massive and sudden. Keller was nearby. He dropped to his knees, began compressions, barked orders at the guards in broken English. The man survived. Barely. But he survived. Afterward, Keller sat outside the hospital, smoking a cigarette someone had given him. His hands were shaking. A Canadian doctor, Captain Wallace, sat down beside him. "You did good work today," Wallace said. Keller said nothing. "You saved a life. That matters." Keller turned to look at him. "He is still a prisoner. So are you." "I know what I am." Wallace nodded. "I think you do. But I wonder if you know what you could be." It was a strange conversation, elliptical, almost cryptic. But it lodged in Keller like a splinter. Over the following months he softened. Not dramatically. Not publicly. But in small, incremental ways. He began teaching first aid classes in the barracks. He stopped refusing work assignments. He wrote a letter to his sister in Berlin, the first in 2 years, and in it he confessed, "I do not know what to believe anymore. The men here are not monsters. That is the hardest part." December 1943. The camp prepared for Christmas with meticulous care. The Canadians permitted the prisoners to organize a celebration, not out of charity exactly but out of recognition that homesickness, left unaddressed, could fester into despair. The men pooled their canteen scrip and purchased ingredients for a feast: flour, sugar, dried fruit, tins of ham. They baked stolen in the mess hall ovens, the scent of cinnamon and marzipan drifting through the barracks like a ghost of home. They carved decorations from scrap wood, stars, angels, miniature nativity scenes. Someone fashioned a Christmas tree from pine branches lashed together with wire. On Christmas Eve, the barracks were lit with candles. The men gathered in silence, shoulder to shoulder, and sang carols in low, uncertain voices. Still nacht. Heilige Nacht. Silent night. Holy night. Horst stood near the back, throat tight, eyes burning. He thought of his mother. He thought of the U-boat crew, most of whom had drowned. He thought of the boy in the bunk beside him, Klaus, who had wept quietly every night for a week after learning his family's house in Cologne had been destroyed. A guard appeared in the doorway. Corporal Dawson. He stood there awkwardly, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. He cleared his throat. From the Red Cross, he said in halting German. Chocolate. For the barracks. He set the package on a table and left without waiting for a response. The men stared at it. Then someone laughed, a short, incredulous bark of sound, and the tension broke. They opened the package. Inside were 50 bars of Swiss chocolate, each wrapped in silver foil. They divided them evenly, one per man, and ate them slowly, savoring each square. Later, after the candles had burned low and the men had drifted to their bunks, Horst lay awake and thought about mercy. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Just mercy, the deliberate choice not to inflict suffering when suffering was expected. It was a small thing perhaps. A bar of chocolate. A carol sung off-key. But smallness, he realized, was not the same as insignificance. He thought, the war has taught us to hate. This place is teaching us something else. By the spring of 1944, the camp had become a strange mirror of the world outside, a microcosm of conflict and coexistence, governed by rules that seemed increasingly surreal as the war ground on. News filtered in through newspapers and radio broadcasts, monitored by Canadian censors but never entirely suppressed. The prisoners learned of D-Day. They learned of the advance into France. They learned, slowly and with growing dread, of the rumors coming out of Poland and Germany, rumors of camps that bore no resemblance to Camp 30, camps where the wire was electrified and the chimneys never stopped smoking. Some dismissed the rumors as propaganda. Others grew quiet and withdrawn, their faces gray with a knowledge they could not articulate. A few sought out the chaplain, a Catholic priest from Montreal who visited weekly, and confessed things they could not confess to anyone else. The chaplain listened. He offered no absolution. He only said again and again, "What you did is between you and God. What you do now is between you and the man beside you." Horst did not speak to the chaplain. He did not know what he would say. He had fired torpedoes at Allied ships. He had watched merchant vessels sink, their crews spilling into the water like insects. He had obeyed orders. He had believed, or convinced himself he believed, that it was necessary. Now, surrounded by decency he did not deserve, he felt the weight of those actions pressing down on him like a physical force. One evening he found Klaus sitting alone near the fence, staring out at the darkening fields. Horst sat beside him. "Do you think we'll go home?" Klaus asked. "Eventually. And when we do, what will we find?" Horst had no answer. He only knew that home, whatever it had been, no longer existed. The apartment in Hamburg was likely rubble. His mother was likely dead. The Germany they had fought for, if it had ever truly existed, was collapsing under the weight of its own cruelty. What remained was this: two men sitting by a fence in Ontario, trying to imagine a future they could not see. "We'll find what's left," Horst said finally. "And we'll build something from it." Klaus nodded. He did not look convinced. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. News of Germany's surrender reached Camp 30 on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered via loudspeaker in terse, unemotional language. The prisoners stood in the yard, faces blank, bodies rigid. Some wept. Some stared at the ground. A few cheered, not for victory but for the simple, overwhelming relief that it was over. Repatriation began slowly. The logistics were staggering. Tens of thousands of prisoners scattered across Canada, all requiring documentation, medical clearance, transportation back to a shattered continent. Horst remained at Camp 30 until the autumn of 1946. By then, the camp had taken on a ghostly quality. Barracks stood empty. The theater was silent. The soccer field grew wild with weeds. In October, Horst and 200 others boarded a train bound for Halifax. From there they would sail to Liverpool, then onward to Germany. The journey felt less like liberation than exile. He carried with him a small bundle of possessions: letters from home, a Red Cross blanket, a worn copy of Der Klang signed by the men in his barracks, and a photograph, Corporal Dawson's photograph, the one showing the farmhouse in Saskatchewan, which Dawson had given him on the last day with a shy smile and a muttered "good luck." At the Halifax docks, Canadian soldiers handed them each a meal kit: sandwiches, apples, a thermos of coffee. No speeches. No ceremony. Just a nod, a handshake and the rattle of the gangplank beneath their feet. Horst stood at the ship's rail as the coast receded. He thought of the knock on the transport truck tailgate, the moment when fear had turned to confusion. He thought of porridge and chocolate and Christmas carols. He thought of Corporal Dawson's hand on his shoulder. He thought of Ernst Keller, who had written in his final letter home, "I have learned that cruelty is easy and restraint is the hardest thing in the world." The ship's horn sounded low and mournful. Horst closed his eyes and felt the wind on his face. Somewhere behind him, Canada disappeared into the fog. Somewhere ahead, Germany waited, broken, occupied, unrecognizable. He did not know what he would find there. He only knew what he had learned here, that civilization was not a given. It was a choice made over and over, in small moments that no one would remember. A choice to feed rather than starve. To speak rather than shout. To see a man, even an enemy, and offer him a cup of tea. By 1947, nearly 6,000 German POWs had chosen to remain in Canada rather than return to the ruins of their homeland. They worked on farms, in factories, in small towns across the prairies. Some married Canadian women. Some changed their names. Some never spoke of the war again. Others carried it with them always, a weight that could not be set down. Horst Muller returned to Hamburg. He found his mother's apartment reduced to a pile of bricks and plaster. He found a city hollowed out, its people moving through the rubble like ghosts. He worked as a carpenter, rebuilding what the war had destroyed. He married a schoolteacher named Anna. He had 3 children. He told them, when they were old enough to ask, that he had been a prisoner in Canada, and that his captors had treated him with a fairness he still did not fully understand. In 1963 he received a letter from Canada. It was from Corporal Dawson, now a middle-aged man with grandchildren, who had tracked him down through Red Cross records. The letter was brief. It said, "I often think of those days. I hope you are well. I hope you found what you were looking for." Horst wrote back. He said, "I did not find what I was looking for, but I found something better. I found proof that mercy is possible, even in the worst of times. Thank you for that." They exchanged letters for years. They never met again. The wire is gone now. Camp 30 was decommissioned in 1946, its barracks dismantled, its land returned to farmland and forest. There is a plaque near the site, weathered and half obscured by ivy, commemorating the men who were held there. But few people stop to read it. History prefers its villains unambiguous and its heroes uncomplicated. This story fits neither mold. It is a story of restraint in a time of rage. Of bureaucracy elevated to morality. Of small gestures that accumulated over months and years into something larger than the sum of their parts. It is a story that asks uncomfortable questions. What do we owe our enemies? How do we remain human when humanity feels like weakness? And what happens when the systems we build to contain violence become, against all odds, instruments of grace? There are no easy answers. Only this, that in the autumn of 1943 57 men climbed down from transport trucks expecting brutality and received instead a bowl of porridge, a blanket, and the words, "You will be treated accordingly." That contradiction, that gap between fear and fairness, changed them. Not all of them. Not permanently. But enough. Enough to matter. If this story moved you, subscribe, because the battles that define us aren't always fought with bullets, and the victories that last aren't always written in history books. The war had taught them fear. The peace taught them mercy. And the line between the two, they learned, was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. A thread of restraint, wound tight, holding back the dark. It could break. It often did. But sometimes in places like Camp 30, in moments no one recorded, it held. And that, perhaps, is the only moral the story needs. They braced for starvation. They were given bread. That simple reversal, that ordinary miracle, reminds us that civilization is not a monument. It is a choice. Made once and then again until the choosing itself becomes a kind of faith.